All right, here we are. I mean, you are where you are, and I am where I am. But through the alchemy of me pushing a record button, you pushing a play button, and the asynchronous universe of the internet that we are all slowly melding with, we have been brought together in a way that actually transcends time and space, which is an ironic and wonderful context for us to listen to today's conversation with Frank Jude Boccio, which I am going to tell you about in just a moment. But first, let me welcome you. Hi, I'm Jay. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. I'm very glad you're here, whether you're someone new or whether you're a returning listener. Thank you for choosing to listen. And if you are a regular listener, you know that I usually record intros and outros like this for the talks, and sometimes I will chat about stuff. I'll share about stuff. Well, not today. I am going to forego my usual ritual of chatting with you all in this intro because today's conversation with Frank Jude Boccio is so very deep and a bit lengthy. I just didn't want to edit it. It's so vital to very important questions that I've been asking in myself. Those of you who do listen to this show probably can tell that I am very often working through things in myself through these conversations. And today's is definitely no exception to that. In fact, I would say the next 2 weeks are sort of follow-up conversations in a way for me. But I'm asking questions about spirituality and about mysticism and materialism and science, and today's conversation encapsulates these things so perfectly and in a way that I think is really constructive and useful. So I am so very grateful to Frank, first just for being someone I could have this kind of conversation with, and then just for coming on the show and letting us record it and share it with everyone. I really think there's so much here, and I am just very glad that you're going to get to hear this conversation today. Real quick before we do, I feel compelled to express some gratitude to our podcast premium subscribers. It is through support from people like Mandy Hoof and David Singleton that I am able to keep doing this like I have. If you have been listening to this show and you haven't had a chance to go back into the archives, or you just want to be someone who's actively supporting this show, then becoming a podcast premium subscriber is the way to do that. It's a choose your rate. You can cancel at any time. If you don't have any money right now, all you have to do is email us and we will send you a free account. But if you are in a position to contribute even a little something, it makes a huge difference, and we are so grateful to you. You can find out about becoming a podcast premium subscriber, as well as all of my other stuff, my live stream classes, my weekly teacher's call. All of my stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, like I said, I don't want to talk about any of my stuff today. I want to just get into it with Frank. So that is what we are going to do. I will touch base on the other side for just a moment, but here we go, y'all. Sit down, maybe get a pencil and paper, and please enjoy this conversation that I had with Frank Jude Boccio. Hello?
Hey.
Hi, Frank.
Hi, Jay.
It's been a little while. I meant to go look and
Well,
see
I
how
did, and it's so weird because I didn't realize this. When I searched for the most recent email from you to see where the Zoom link was, the one from 2019 came up, and it was February 7th, 2019. And I was like, holy crap. It's like, you probably don't even know, it was literally 2 months after that I got diagnosed with cancer.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So I've had 2019, cancer put me out of commission and having to cancel all my gigs, and then COVID happened. So,
oh my gosh.
Ride.
Oh my gosh. Well, how are you doing now?
Well, the last tests, things seem okay. It was prostate cancer, so we just have to make sure that my PSA doesn't, because I didn't have surgery, I had radiation, so I still have a prostate, so I still generate some PSA. So you just have to make sure it doesn't get high, and it's been fine so far. I've had 18 months post-treatment already.
Okay. Well, I am recording right now. You know that. It's okay that we just talked about that, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, as you might guess, I published on my blog about it.
Okay. I just want to make sure, because I didn't know any of that. So I didn't know if you were okay talking about that. But wow, I'm so glad to hear that you're doing okay. I mean, that's crazy. And like two punches, 1-2 punch.
Yeah. Well, it was wild because I was actually teaching in Kentucky. And I had a biopsy because my PSA was high. My father had it, so his genetics is really a major part of it. So I wasn't surprised, but it was really interesting. Is as part of the workshop that I was leading, we did the 5 remembrances, which is a profound practice. I've been practicing since I learned it from Thich Nhat Hanh in 1992, And in my Dharma talk afterwards, I reminded everybody that every one of us, that there's no real hard, fast demarcation between health and illness. Like every healthy body has cancerous cells in it, but that some of us, it goes past a certain line and then we are diagnosed with it, but we all have cancer cells. I walked outside and I looked at my phone and there was a message, and this is on a Saturday from my urologist. So I was like, oh, this is not good. And I called him up, and it was positive. Yeah.
But I guess they caught it in an earlier stage and you didn't have to do surgeries, and that's a blessing.
Yeah. It was like right in the middle. It could have been better and it could have been worse. But given my age and my overall general good health and the longevity of both of my parents, the advice was you should treat this. Like if I was like 75 with that same kind of cancer, they might have said, let's just watch for another year or two. Mm-hmm. But at 60, well, at the time, I guess I was 63, they were like, no, I think you need to really deal with this, because it was a fairly aggressive, but just not a lot. So, yeah.
Wow. Wow. I'm glad to be speaking with you and to hear that you're doing okay. I mean, when we spoke in February 2019, I remember we spoke about your book, Mindfulness Yoga, that had an impact on me. We spoke about, Zen naturalism. Mm-hmm. And we talked about having smaller groups that were more in depth rather than trying to reach broader groups of people and stuff. And I had it in mind, I've been reaching out to different teachers, some who've been on the show before, just to sort of see what's been happening with everyone. We're kind of emerging from these quarantines. I'm trying to figure out what I'm doing, and I just sort of like trying to figure out what if other people will share what they're doing. And I thought of you. And then I have to say, though, you sent me that email with the links to some of the things that you've written recently. In particular, this one that you referred to as some sort of kind of manifesto called Religious But Not Spiritual.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I was like, oh, this is like a whole other conversation. And in a way, to me, even a more interesting conversation, because it's connected to other things that I've been talking about too. So I've got a lot of questions about that thing that you wrote, Frank. And so maybe we can get to what's going on nowadays later. I am curious about some of the stuff that you wrote. Now, I guess I'm just going to jump in. Is that okay?
Yeah, hell, yeah, that's what we're here for.
All right, because because there's a lot of stuff in there, and I have got questions. So, just for anybody who's listening, this piece that you wrote, and you'll jump in and add to it or correct me if you think anything I'm saying is wrong, or not do you think is accurate. It's called Religious but Not Spiritual. And you sort of start by kind of pointing to this phrase, which I've certainly heard many times before too, but when people say, I'm spiritual but not religious. And you then go ahead to, I guess, establish some definitions and terms for spirituality and religion, which I think is important. Now, my first thing that I noticed that I kind of needed to ask you about, which was curious to me and maybe problematic, is that in this consideration of spirituality and religion, I don't think that you even wrote the word God once.
I did not.
And I'm interested how it is that we can have a conversation about religion and spirituality without the word God. And I want to be a little bit more specific for you. And where I felt like right off the bat, I was like, wait a second, because you gave a definition for spirituality, which is if you go to Google and you type in define spirituality, it'll say the quality of being concerned with the human spirit or soul as opposed to material or physical things. Like that's like the first one that pops up. But when you gave the definition of religion, you didn't do that. Like you did the etymology of religion and did an analysis that essentially equated it with yoga. But when I typed in define religion into Google, the definition that I got said the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods.
That was in a dictionary?
That was what I got when I typed in define religion to Google.
I would love to know like where this was, because Buddhism's not the only non-theistic religion. There are actually other religions that do not hold to that. That's a very Western, monotheistic, Abrahamic definition.
Right.
In fact, Richard Gombrich, who's a scholar of specifically Theravadan Buddhism, writes in his book on Theravada Buddhism that he was interviewing a Thai monk and specifically asked, what's the role of God? And the monk said, what does God have to do with religion? In Buddhism, there's no being that measures or matches that definition that you just gave.
I mean, I think you're right to make the distinction between like an Eastern spiritual paradigm or whatever, or philosophical thought, and like a Judeo-Christian viewpoint. And I think that definition that I read, it's more why I think it's one of the reasons why I think people say spiritual but not religious.
I think it's
because if religion is defined that way, people want a way to pray or do whatever it is their spirituality is without having to be about superhuman controlling powers or hierarchical power structures.
Yes, I agree. And I also think there are two major motivations behind the I'm spiritual, not religious. And you just hit on one of them. Generally, those people who think of themselves as spiritual often do fit the definition where like there is still some kind of transcendent realm, but they might not think of it as like a god or goddess specifically. But the other, because the survey that I did, the other one that comes back often, and this was my major criticism of it, or not even criticism, I'm like, fine, if that's how you want to define it. I was basically putting out why I don't feel comfortable saying that. And one of the major motivations that kept coming back over and over again was that people were understandably, given Western history, thinking of religion as a very institutional, hierarchical, right, kind of structure. And that's why I was really looking at, let's look at the etymology. And the etymology is religion. Religio is a practice. It's a thing. It's not an institution. It's and in that sense, very much like what yoga is, because originally the word religio was often used agriculturally to refer to like shaping a tree or something. You know, you bind back the branches so you give it a shape. It's a discipline. So given our history, of course, when people think of religion, they think of like the Catholic Church or something like that, with creeds, dogma, hierarchy, as you said. And what I was pointing to is like, that's a very specific understanding. And given that religion doesn't require gods, actually, and that if you emphasize it as a practice, I'm much more comfortable with that, because there is really no way, I think, that we could avoid the immaterial, transcendent when we talk about spirit. I don't believe in a soul, right? I don't believe in spirits. Spiritualism is a huge influence on Western New Age thought and everything else, and it's like that. It just doesn't work for me. But if you remember in the essay, I did say I can use it metaphorically, like, you know, the group spirit here is kind of low. Let's get the energy up or something like that. But I'm very much using it metaphorically. That's why I have that huge addendum at the end of the article with all the different ways that I feel spirit can be used, you know, as a prevailing tendency, a motivating force, an animating principle, a person's mood. You know, my spirits were low. That's all fine. But like when I'm talking about my practice, it has nothing to do with spirits or gods.
Okay, well, we have to define spirit, because when you say spirits or gods, you seem to be implying like mystical beings that have powers that don't exist here in the material realm in the same way that we are, but can be tapped into, or, you know, you seem to be pointing to something. But I think that I do think that I have some issue with the idea that there's no such thing as I don't know what you mean by soul or spirit. And I guess my issue is that I find it hard to believe that this phenomena of you and me existing and talking right now can kind of be reduced to just simple, basic matter, like two human beings come together and like a spark of life's created, and you start out as a conglomeration of cells, and then you congeal into some being that has a life. I mean, there's some aspect to that simply can't be like measured in a double-blind placebo study. And there's certainly what I want to assert as a magic to the phenomena that takes place in life. And to me, the magic is that, you know, subatomic particles come together, as you say, create this, and there's emergent properties like consciousness, like awareness, like love. And, you know, I think the mistake a lot of people make, there's a really great book by Sean Carroll, the physicist. He's a cosmologist, called The Big Picture. And he teaches something that I was like, oh my gosh, this is like, you know, he calls it poetic naturalism. And it's like, you know, it's ridiculous. You can talk about baseball using Newtonian physics and miss the whole point of baseball, you know, and strikes and balls and everything else. But it doesn't deny the fact that at root, it's basic Newtonian physics, right? But it would be ridiculous to speak or talk, you know, like a sports announcer, a commentator, giving a commentation on a baseball game from that level. So we speak different stories, different narratives, right? So that's what I'm getting at, that there's like, yeah, of course, I do believe. I think it's interesting too, like mere matter. I keep hearing that a lot. You know, it's like, do you understand what we mean by matter now? I mean, it's not like, you know, clay. It's
it's awesome. And again, awe is the religious experience, you know. You look at someone like Carl Sagan, who's very religious in that sense. And he would even say that, you know, the problem with most religious doctrines and everything else is that they're too small to even begin to cover what, you know, is being revealed through science, for instance, right? So like the science brings him to that same religious experience of awe.
I agree. I just had Christine Weber on a few weeks ago. We were talking about David Bohm and his thing on wholeness and implicate order. And it seems to me that I agree that like science offers this lens, and when it's looked through in like a kind of what I want to say sort of pure science way, like in a way that's true to what I understand the scientific method to be, we are like observing and making a hypothesis and proving your theories or disproving theories or whatever it is. There is an awe-inspiring nature to that.
Yeah.
However, wait, there's a however, because it's not always in the same way like we started today. Like religion isn't always defined the same way. Like science often is very reductionist. It actually obscures what we're looking at rather than like makes it clear to us depending on how that science is done.
I totally disagree. I don't think it obscures at all. First of all, the scientific methodologies, there's not just one method, is based upon a questioning that I actually find most religions don't have the courage to do. You know, they like even in Buddhism, we were talked about like great doubt, great awakening, but then there was always something that was like kind of sacred, which literally means put aside, that you don't question. Science is about questioning anything and everything, and the humility of recognizing that we have nothing but provisional truths, right? Western religion, and to a large extent, Eastern religion, as institutional structures, offer a kind of very hubristically, like an idea that they have truth with a capital T, and I reject that out of hand, including from my own, you know, like Zen naturalism. On the website, it talks about that we're always have to maintain the don't know mind that allows us to maintain intimacy with reality. And when new evidence is revealed, we have to be willing to change and follow that no matter where it goes, even if it's things that we might not like, you know, rather than be ideological. Another piece I wrote once was how research has shown that the more people are attached to values, ideology, or identity, which really is important given all the identity politics that's going on, the more people are attached to those three things, the more they are knowledge resistant, meaning that if they are presented any evidence that goes against their belief, if they're very attached to those three things, they will resist it, right? And that is why I think that we're in such a polarized, horrible state, not just in this country, in this world right now, because there's so much attachment to ideology, identity. I mean, the racial polarity has gotten worse in the last 10 years because of that kind of thinking. And we see it over and over again. So the idea of really being willing to keep that don't know mind so that we can be open to receiving new information and being willing to change is what is essential.
I completely agree with that. And the idea that some person has a truth, capital T, that would be true for anyone other than that person trying to assert it is a problem. I agree. But my issue is that you seem to be talking about science in a way as though it's immune from all of that like science is above that. And I haven't seen that to be true. I feel like science is corrupted like many religions. And I think
you're making a mistake between science. Like, science is nothing other than a way of thinking, of approaching, which is very counterintuitive. As the Buddha says, it goes against the stream of our conditioning to be this way. But it's done by humans who are fallible. And yes, science has been misused by people. One thing that's different about science than most religions is that it is self-corrective. So the horrible, for instance, genetics of the 20th century is completely rejected and overturned, right? The caste system is still operating. I just listened to something today that was just horrendous about, the caste politics right now in India, right? So that goes back thousands of years, right? The eugenics, no real biologist or anything else, any scientist now would countenance any of that, which was, so that's what I'm talking about. This, if we're really engaged with science, first of all, it's a communal property. It's not just, but because it's communal, it's self-corrective, and there's nothing else that I can think of as a human institution that actually shares that. That's why it's always changing.
But you just shift. You said that science is a way of thinking, but then you're now referring to it as an institution. So to me, like, science is connected to academia and to like these institutions of power. It's not just, I'm thinking scientifically and therefore it is science. It's that these are institutions. And the other issue I have is that science is ultimately a way of quantifying. And are there not things in our experience and in life that are qualitative in ways that just simply don't lend themselves to being quantified?
There are like qualities like love, right? Yes, of course. But we could also understand a lot about love by understanding the anatomy, psychology, all of these things, right? So there's nothing that's completely.
But can you understand? I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is really deep, Frank. But how can you understand love by measuring what happens in someone's synapses when they fire, or whether their heart rate pulses or whatever? Is that really understanding? Like, you can measure what happens in somebody's body when they're experiencing what they call love. Is that understanding love?
Well, you know what? I don't know. I'm willing to say I don't know, because there are already things happening right now that I would never have expected. Right. I was just listening to one of the podcasts that I listen to fairly regularly, and even the reporters were like stunned at how looking at individual neurons firing, they were able to know what someone was thinking, like the words, which opens up the possibility that people who are in, that it's a horrible syndrome where you're like locked in.
I think I know what you're talking, but I can't remember the name of it either.
Well, I think it might even be called locked in syndrome or something like, and because they were literally able, again, very rudimentarily, but like specific neurons firing, they were able to know the thoughts of the person 97% of the time. That's amazing. And like, to me, that was science fiction, So I don't know, but like, that's it. But for me, it's still irrelevant, because we're talking about, a subjective experience. My love for my daughter, is, there's no way. I think you have daughters too, so maybe we have some understanding, but we don't really know what that's like for either of us.
But what I hear you saying is that, like, as I've studied yoga, and in particular yoga philosophy, the one thing that I've had communicated to me and I have seen proven true in my own experience is that the only way that you come to understand something that is of a qualitative whole nature that doesn't lend itself to being reduced down to small parts is it's your observed experience. That, right, in a way, your observed experience is and your own intuition and your feeling, like you're discounting all those things as, not as valuable or not as significant or not as of merit as science, which isn't subject to all of these, foibles.
No, you just created a bit of a straw man there. I never said anything like that. What I will say, though, is, and this is something, metacognition has shown us why intuition goes wrong so often. People who have expertise in an area have better intuition around that expertise.
Sure.
But they might not have any great intuition around something else. So like a physicist.
Sure, but they're still using their intuition around their expertise to do it. You just discounted intuition in there.
I said their intuition around, let's say like a quantum physicist is going to have great intuition. You and our intuition around quantum physics is going to suck. Right.
But my intuition about me, about what I need and who I want to be and what my purpose is in life
is also open to fallibility.
Of course. Right? But I know being me, I'm an expert in being me more than anybody else. You said I have better intuition around what I'm an expert in, right?
You know what? That's a very common thing that's in pop psychology, but no one can fool you better than you can fool yourself.
Of course, but no one can know me better than me either.
Really?
Come on, who can know me better than me?
No one, but you can't know yourself as well as you think you do.
Well, that's fair, but of course, we all have misperceptions and we make mistakes and we learn from them, but ultimately, who's the authority? Who's the authority? Scientific method or my own ability to discern my thoughts and feelings and what I think to be true?
Do you think you know why you do what you do?
Do I think I know why? Sometimes I feel like I know what my motivations are. Sometimes I don't. What does that have to do with who the authority is? What I react to is it feels like authority has been given to something outside of me. That the data knows better than I can know. And, I read that book, How to Lie with Statistics, and whatever data set it is, whether it's scientifically connected, research papers, that data is open to interpretation and can be used in all kinds of ways and is subjective. It's not objective. And yes, my subjective experience is subjective, but I think that to devalue a person's subjective experience because there are examples of people out there who are wrong about themselves and sometimes they do stupid stuff. I don't know. That makes me very uncomfortable.
And again, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I am in this case, arguing for that kind of humility that I see lacking in, in this COVID pandemic, the people coming out of the woodworks who seem to think they know better than virologists and epidemiologists. It was just mind-blowing, but not really, because one of the points that you haven't touched on in my essay is that, again, as defined, when people talk about spirituality, right? And we didn't even talk, let's back up a little bit before I get to that. Mm-hmm. Again, even in my survey, people used words about qualities that they equate with spirituality that, as I wrote, are purely naturalistic. Why? They're simple human values. Values like connection, love, what were some of the other ones that came up? A sense of being part of something larger than one's individuality and everything else. These are human qualities. What makes them spiritual?
I mean, I agree with that part of your essay. I think that some of those things that you were talking about are, in what you were talking about before, in the spirit of being a human being, I wish to be kind or friendly or compassionate. I get that. They're more like morals and values, and which is maybe more of this realm or whatever, or the phenomenal realm.
So with that in mind, it really also was like, really, wow, it's like, all these people professing in the yoga, contemporary yoga world, to being spiritual, and all the talk about being, like all one and everything else. I also sent you links to like my criticism of the neoliberalism that has permeated much of the mindfulness movement and contemporary yoga. And so I also saw the reaction in the wellness community and the yoga community during this pandemic as indicating that, again, that neoliberal hypervaluation of the individual. And I thought it was really interesting because this is a quote from the wiki article about spirituality as it's understood, right? And I wrote here that it's a very important aspect of a self-identity. In contemporary usage, spirituality often becomes associated with the interior life of the individual, placing an emphasis upon the well-being of the mind, body, spirit. And you see that in all the ads and Instagram and everything else, right? And religion refers to organizational or communal dimensions, right? And so I saw that really happening with the hypervalorization of the individual over community that I see rampant in contemporary yoga, wellness communities, even in pop Buddhist communities. And it's why I think, or at least one reason why so many practitioners started sprouting QAnon dogma, individual sovereignty, and placing subjective truth over evidence, the hypervaluation, like, again, it's not an either or, but like when there's this hyper, extreme, like postulating lived experience over data, over over the context, right? Someone could have a lived experience and it could feel very real for them, but to then say this is how it really is, I mean, all of us have had that experience, I'm sure, where like someone is telling us this is their lived experience, and if it involves us and everything else, and we know that it's not at all what was meant, for instance, when something was said. We just assume and we project so much, right? And I think that combined with this hypervalorization of the subjective, right? I am not saying negate the subjective, but there's a really beautiful Zen poem that has a line in it where it says, the subject is the subject because of the object. The object is the object because of the subject, right? Only in our conceptual mind can we think of a subject independent of the object and vice versa, right? And when we do that, we miss the relationship and the communal aspects. And that's what I see happening politically, socially, and dare I say religiously, not just in this country. It's really spreading.
Well, there's a lot in that. I will say, I mean, I'm in agreement with a lot of what you said. I certainly think that there was a lot of folks within the yoga and wellness world who were vulnerable to conspiracy theories and QAnon. And I think that there was a lot of hucksters out there who manipulate people. And we've seen those hucksters within the yoga world. And we've seen people who were esteemed gurus who have been revealed to be actually abusive. Mm-hmm. And so I certainly think that there were those threads. And I think that I will say, I think a lot of the social media platforms fuel this bifurcation that you're saying is not there. And I think that, for me, my issue is that I'm not against science at all. I value science. Science has saved my wife and served me in my life. I have no problem with Western medicine or science. But just now when you presented it and you said the evidence, there's a lot of evidence that's been presented to us over the last 16 months that if you go to the CDC website yourself, you'll read one thing, but when you read the New York Times article about it, it's presented in a different way. And I've taken criticisms for saying things like that, but it's just true. And any reasonable person would have to admit that we live in a situation where the information that we get and the way that information comes to us is such that you're speaking as though it's definitive when someone releases this information and then you find out that it was wrong. Of course, people have questioned it. I don't think the reasons why people were attracted to QAnon or are rejecting what are obvious scientific conclusions is just because of spirituality's problem of definition. There's all kinds of other factors that are leading to that.
What you're getting to there, Jay, too, is the failure, and I wonder whose interests really does this benefit. Science is taught miserably in, what are they calling it? Elementary school? When I was a kid, it was grammar school. But seeing people get confused. We've got a novel situation. Of course, scientists, when they were talking in the beginning of all this stuff, right? They were couching everything they said with lots of ifs, modeling, everything else. But the populace and our media really feeds this. Right? Media presents things terribly when it comes to science. And so people don't understand. They take the fact that the story told, like what scientists say changes as a weakness. That's the strength of science. That as new material came in, they changed what they were given, right? And people want certainty. Science doesn't provide that, and when you've got a novel situation, there's going to be confusion and change, and scientists were talking about that, but the media did a horrible job for the most part. There were a couple of really good science journalists, but I read somewhere that over the last 30 years, science journalism has lost, there's very few papers have specific departments with people who were trained to communicate science. Back in the 60s and 70s, they had whole departments. And I think that's a real major failure. Because when people think that, that first they said this and now they're saying that, so let's throw out the science. And says, no, that's exactly how science works. That's a failure of education, of explaining that is actually a strength, that things change. And the other thing is that, I think about there's a sutra that a lot of, again, this is very typical of neoliberalism in modern Buddhism. There's a sutra where the Buddha it's very famous. You probably have heard about it, the Kalama Sutta, where, the Kalamas are saying, different teachers come in here and they say different things and they each say that they've got the truth, we're confused. And the Buddha says, yeah, that's a very confusing situation. I'd be confused too. And then he goes through a whole list of ways that we know, right? Or think we know, right? And basically he says, don't accept things just because they're taught by your tradition, or because they're in your scriptures, because your teacher says so, because you deduced it, or all these different ways, which, rationality and everything else, everything he mentions has strengths and weaknesses, right? Some authorities are speaking the truth, but some are not. So you can't just take it from an argument from authority. So he goes through all these things, and then he says, you have to see for yourself what leads to suffering, what leads to happiness, right? And that's what you have to do. But there's a clause that I find interesting that most modern teachers never say. And because it's, again, pointing to this hypervalorization of the individual and my truth, right? Because he also says, see for yourself.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.